The year is 399 BC. Athens, a city whose name was synonymous with civilization. The city that gave the world democracy, theater, and philosophy. Here, on these streets, Pericles delivered his famous speeches on liberty. Here, on the slopes of the Acropolis, Sophocles and Euripides made thousands of citizens experience the tragedies of gods and heroes. Here, it seemed, the very air was suffused with reason and the pursuit of truth. But on this day, the air over Athens was heavy. The golden age was over, its luster dimmed by the fires of a long war and a deadly plague. The city was just beginning to recover from a humiliating defeat and a bloody dictatorship. And on this very day, the city that prided itself on its freedom of speech was preparing to commit its most shameful act. It had sentenced a 70-year-old man to death. Not a warrior fallen in battle, not a traitor who sold his homeland, but a philosopher. A man whose only weapon was questions, and whose only battlefield was the mind of his fellow citizen. His name was Socrates. How could this have happened? Why did the cradle of democracy decide to silence its most famous thinker? The official charges of corrupting the youth and impiety were just a convenient smokescreen. The real reasons ran deeper. They were rooted in fear, in political intrigue, and in a desperate attempt to find a culprit for the catastrophes that had befallen the great city. This is not just a story about one man's trial. This is the story of how democracy, when poisoned by fear, can devour its own children. To understand why he was killed, one must first understand who Socrates was to Athens and what Athens was to Socrates. He was the flesh and blood of this city. The son of a stonemason and a midwife, he was not an aristocrat by birth, but he became a prince of the spirit. He was a veteran who had fought bravely for his polis in several battles of the Peloponnesian War. He was a citizen who, unlike many, never left Athens, believing his place was here. But he was a strange citizen. While other Athenians strove for wealth or political glory, Socrates disdained both. He walked barefoot in the same old tunic, and, to the horror of his wife Xanthippe, brought almost no money home. His only occupation, his work and his passion, was conversation. He called it examination. His method, which we now call Socratic, was brilliant in its simplicity. He would approach a man who was considered an expert on some subject, a politician discussing justice, a general talking about courage, a poet writing about beauty. Feigning complete ignorance, Socrates would ask him to define the concept. After receiving a confident answer, he would begin to ask clarifying questions, each of which exposed a contradiction or an exception to the rule. By the end of the conversation, the respected Athenian, who considered himself an expert, was left in a state of utter confusion, unable to define what he thought he understood best. Socrates called this maiectics, or the art of midwifery, in honor of his mother's profession. He claimed that he did not insert knowledge into people, but merely help them give birth to their own truth, which was already within them, by casting off false opinions. But to his opponents, it felt like a public intellectual humiliation. It is important to understand that Socrates did this against the backdrop of the activities of the so-called sophists. These were itinerant, paid teachers of wisdom who taught the youth the art of rhetoric, the ability to persuade a crowd and win arguments in court, often regardless of where the truth lay. To many ordinary Athenians, Socrates, with his endless arguments and the crowd of rich youths around him, was no different from the sophists. They saw him as a man who taught how to make the weaker argument the stronger and undermined traditional values. And although Socrates himself despised the sophists and never took money for his conversations, this bad reputation stuck to him. He drove dozens of the most influential men in Athens to fury. He did this not out of malice. He believed he had received this mission from the god Apollo through the oracle at Delphi. His famous phrase, "I know that I know nothing," is not an ode to ignorance. It is the foundation of true philosophy, the admission of one's own ignorance as the first step toward knowledge. He called himself a gadfly, sent to sting the lazy Athenian horse to keep it from falling asleep. But who likes being constantly stung? In a peaceful and prosperous time, Socrates' activities might have remained the eccentricity of a strange philosopher. But the Athens of the late 5th century BC was neither peaceful nor prosperous. It was a cauldron, boiling with passion, fear, and hatred. For over a quarter of a century, from 431 to 404 BC, the city had been locked in the grueling Peloponnesian War with its mortal enemy, Sparta. This war, in the words of the historian Thucydides, was the greatest upheaval to shake the Hellenic world. At its very beginning, when Pericles locked the entire population of Attica behind the city walls, a terrible epidemic broke out, known to history as the Plague of Athens. It claimed the lives of a third of the population, including Pericles himself. Thucydides, who survived it, left horrific descriptions. People in good health were all of a sudden attacked. Internally, the heat was so great that they could not bear to have on them even the lightest clothing. Tormented by an unquenchable thirst, they threw themselves into wells. The death of Pericles was an irreplaceable loss. The era of wise and balanced decisions was over. Power in the popular assembly was seized by demagogues, aggressive populists like Cleon, who played on the base instincts of the crowd. Democracy became unmanageable. The height of this adventurism was the Sicilian expedition in 415 BC. The Athenians, persuaded by the honeyed words of the charismatic aristocrat Alcibiades, sent a massive fleet and army to conquer Sicily. The campaign turned into the worst military catastrophe in the city's history. Nearly the entire fleet was destroyed, and tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or sold into slavery in the stone quarries. And here, the shadows of the past begin to close in on Socrates. For Alcibiades, that brilliant but unprincipled adventurer, was his most famous and beloved associate. He admired Socrates' wisdom, but never heeded his teaching on virtue. When accused of sacrilege, Alcibiades defected to the Spartans and became their chief advisor, helping them to crush his own homeland. In the eyes of the people, he was traitor number one, and Socrates was his teacher. Defeat in the war in 404 BC was humiliating. The Spartans dictated harsh peace terms. They destroyed the long walls that protected the city, and worst of all, dismantled the democracy. A pro-Spartan oligarchic regime came to power, known to history as the 30 Tyrants. Their rule was short, but unbelievably bloody. In 8 months, they executed some 1,500 citizens without trial, confiscated their property, and exiled 5,000 more. They sought to eradicate the very spirit of democracy. And at the head of this junta was Critias, a talented writer, an intellectual, and, like Alcibiades, a former student from Socrates' innermost circle. Socrates himself did not cooperate with the tyrants. He famously refused their order to arrest an innocent rich man, Leon of Salamis, so they could execute him and seize his money. The other 4 men obeyed, but Socrates, in his own words, simply went home, risking his life. But by then, few cared. When the Democrats under Thrasybulus overthrew the tyranny a year later and restored democracy, the city was rife with paranoia. An amnesty was declared, forbidding prosecution for past political crimes.
but the thirst for revenge remained. So Socrates' enemies found a loophole. He could not be tried as the teacher of tyrants, but he could be tried for impiety and corrupting the youth. The two most odious figures of the era, the traitor Alcibiades and the tyrant Critias, became the main unspoken exhibits against him. The association was fatal.
In 399 BC, 3 citizens brought Socrates to trial. Their names are worth remembering: Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon. Meletus, a young and unknown poet, was the formal plaintiff. Anytus, a professional orator, represented the rhetoricians he had insulted. But the real organizer and driving force of the trial was Anytus, a wealthy owner of tanneries, an influential democratic politician, a hero of the resistance against the 30 Tyrants. He had a personal score to settle. His own son had been in Socrates' circle, and Anytus believed the philosopher had led him astray. But Anytus's motives were also political. As a leader of the restored democracy, he saw Socrates as a threat to stability. The charges were cleverly formulated to bypass the amnesty. First, Socrates corrupts the youth. What was this really about? He taught them the most dangerous thing of all: to doubt. To doubt the authority of their fathers, the wisdom of politicians, the sanctity of tradition. In a traumatized post-war society clinging desperately to old certainties, such activity was seen as subverting the foundations of the state. And the examples of Critias and Alcibiades were the prosecution's best evidence. Behold the fruits of your teaching. The second charge: he does not respect the gods the city respects, but introduces new divinities. This was even more dangerous. In the ancient world, religion and politics were inseparable. The Athenians believed their defeat in the war was a punishment from the gods. The city was gripped by a new religious fundamentalism. Any deviation from the norm was considered a threat to national security. Socrates' criticism of the myths about the gods, his assertion that gods can only be good, was seen as heresy. And his mysterious inner voice, the daimonion, became the perfect new divinity for the prosecution. A trial in Athens was a contest in eloquence. The defendant was expected to beg, to weep, to bring his crying wife and children to court. Socrates did none of this. His defense speech, known to us from Plato's account as the Apology, was not an excuse. It was his last and most defiant sermon. With mocking ease, he caught Meletus in logical contradictions, showing that he did not even understand his own charges. He did not deny his activities. On the contrary, he declared that his mission to awaken the Athenians was a duty given to him by the god himself. It was in this speech that he delivered his famous metaphor. Athens, he said, is like a great and noble horse who has become sluggish due to his size. And I am the gadfly, sent by the god to sting him, to wake him, and to keep him from falling asleep. The jurors were furious. He was comparing them, the citizens of the great city, to a lazy beast. The vote was cast by secret ballot, with jurors dropping bronze tokens into urns. The verdict: guilty. The margin was razor thin, 280 to 221. Just 30 votes decided his fate. But he still had a chance. According to Athenian procedure, the defendant could propose an alternative punishment. Everyone expected him to propose exile or a heavy fine. But Socrates remained true to himself. In his final, most biting irony, he declared that for his long service to the city, he deserved not punishment, but the highest reward. He proposed that he be given free meals for life in the Prytaneum, the place where Olympic champions and the city's greatest benefactors were honored. This was a slap in the face to the entire court. For this insult, they would not forgive him. In the second vote, to choose between the death penalty and a fine that Socrates' friends eventually offered, many more voted for death. 360 to 141. He had signed his own death warrant.
He spent another month in prison, awaiting the return of the sacred ship from the island of Delos, during which time executions were forbidden. His friends, wealthy and influential, arranged for his escape. Everything was ready. His childhood friend Crito came to him and pleaded with him to flee, for his children, for his friends, for his very life. But Socrates refused. In the famous dialogue Crito, he imagined the laws of Athens themselves speaking to him. "Socrates, what are you planning to do? Did we not give you birth? Did we not raise you? You have lived with us for 70 years, and if you run away now, you will become our destroyer." He explained that to escape would be to betray the very laws he had taught obedience to. "One must not treat injustice with more injustice," he said. "It is better to die a victim of the injustice of men than to live as a criminal against the law." This was his final lesson, a lesson in civil courage. On the day of his execution, as Plato describes in the dialogue Phaedo, he conversed with his friends about the immortality of the soul. He was cheerful and calm, comforting them. When the cup was brought, he asked the jailer if he could make a libation to the gods, but was told there was just enough poison. Then Socrates prayed and drank the poison as if it were wine at a banquet. He walked about the cell until his legs grew heavy, and then he lay down. The coldness slowly rose from his feet to his heart. His final words, addressed to Crito, were, "We owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please, don't forget to pay the debt." Asclepius was the god of healing. To offer him a rooster was to give thanks for a cure. Socrates saw death as the cure for the soul from the prison of the body. So why did Athens execute Socrates? He was not killed by the law, but by fear. The fear of a society traumatized by war of any form of dissent. He was killed by the desperate pride of those whose ignorance he had exposed to the world. He was killed by the desperate desire of the mob to find a simple culprit for their complex problems. Athens soon repented. It is said his accusers were exiled, and Miletus was even executed. But it was too late. They had killed the man, but they had created a legend. His student Plato, shattered by his teacher's death, dedicated his life to immortalizing his image and ideas, creating the philosophy that would define the course of all Western thought. That eternal gadfly of humanity still won't let us sleep, forcing us to ask ourselves the most uncomfortable questions again and again. Socrates lost the trial, but he won eternity.